Welcome everyone to today's AGU AGI Heads and Chairs webinar. My name is Leila Gonzalez, and I will be sitting in here with Pranoti Asher, who is the Assistant Director of Grants and Education Programs at AGU, Eva Kostu, who's the Program Manager at the AGU Bridge Program, and Christopher Keene, who is the Director of Geoscience Profession and Higher Education at AGI.
All right, thanks, Leila. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are very excited to have our October webinar be all about mentoring and storytelling about mentoring. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Marisela Martinez-Cola is an assistant professor of sociology at Morehouse College. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology and African American studies at the University of Michigan. She went on to get her law degree at Loyala University, Chicago School of Law. Following that, she spent about a decade or so in sort of student services and student affairs kinds of departments at various institutions, and then decided to go back to academia. So she went and pursued her Ph.D. in sociology at Emory University, and then was a faculty member for a few years at the Utah State University, after which she joined the faculty at Morehouse. So with that, I'm going to let you take it away and share your stories about mentoring. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you all so much. I'm really, really pleased to be here. I was just sharing that this is actually the fun part of what I get to do. So I hope that you're able to learn something from this presentation, take something away from it that hopefully you'll find useful. And I'm going to kind of get through it so that because the question and answer session is always so much more fun for me. So let's get started, shall we? I like to do this with my students. I always like to give a roadmap of what it is that we're going to be talking about today to kind of give you an idea of where we're at in the presentation. So I'm going to give a brief introduction about me. Then I'm going to talk about the genesis and the purpose of the article that I wrote. This talk is based on an article of the same title, Collectors, Nightlights, and Allies, Oh My. The title of it is White Mentors in the Academy. But for these conversations, I've changed it to Advice for Strengthening Cross-Racial Mentoring Opportunities. And so this is really based on an article that I wrote and has been fortunately well received. From there, I'm going to talk about an analogy that I hope that you would be able to keep in mind as we go through to really sort of help understand kind of where I'm coming from. Finally, I'm going to actually describe the categories that I identify in my article. And then before that, after that, I want to be able to talk about the trajectories. A lot of times, all the things that kind of happen before we, and when I say we, I mean BIPOC mentees, get to you. And then hopefully we'll end with some practical advice if we can be able to get to that. We may not be able to, but that's okay. Well, we can tackle it in the Q&A if we don't. So thank you all so much. So first, I guess I should start with just a quick introduction. I'm the first in my family to go to college. You've heard my sort of credentials, and that was very, very meaningful for me growing up, was being the first in my family. And I think it was really interesting because it went from being an honor to being a label when I went into college. And a lot of times people don't talk about sort of the burn of being, they would often call me a trailblazer, right? Marisela, you're a trailblazer, but they would never talk about sort of the burn of being a trailblazer and what happens when you start to kind of set yourself apart, particularly from your family, because of the experiences that you've had. And we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted you to kind of know where it is that I come from, and as a first gener, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to go into medicine, law, business, or engineering, right? Those are the 4 areas you're supposed to do. Well, I stink at math and science, but I could argue well. And so that's how I ended up going to law school. And while I loved the study of law, I hated the practice of it. And so I ended up, as I said, working in multicultural affairs for several years. And I wanted to go back to get my Ph.D. Now, this article was something that I had kind of written along the way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the genesis of the article. So I was asked to attend what's called an MMUF, so the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship event. This is a wonderful program for undergraduate students of color to be paired with a seasoned scholar and engage in research. And as one of the few graduate students of color, I'm often asked to attend events like these. Back at the time, I was a grad student. So I was always asked to come and talk about my experience being a Chicana, being Mexican American and getting my Ph.D. And one of the students asked, you know, a really great question. You know, what should we look for in a mentor, right? Which is an excellent question for an undergraduate to ask. Now, one of the things is we were sort of in that very rarefied space that a person of color we don't have a chance to get very often when there were only people of color in the room. And whenever that happens, it's an opportunity to really just sort of to kind of be real, right? You know, a person of color doesn't have to edit themselves or worry about being misunderstood or misinterpreted or even, you know, perhaps hurting somebody's feelings. And so it was an opportunity to just kind of get real about it, right? And so after they asked me, what should I look for in a mentor? I kind of got, this was an opportunity for me to get, I really kind of got candid, you know, and I told them, I said, well, you know, the likelihood of you, when you get a mentor, you know, it's going to be a high likelihood that the mentor will likely be white, you know, because frankly, there are not a lot of very many people like myself around, right? I told them because there's so few of us BIPOC faculty who are full-time, you will, or for myself at the time of grad student, you will encounter and connect with some of us, right? And many of us will welcome it because it's one of the reasons why we entered our fields, right? To encourage you to find what it is that you love. But unfortunately, we can't mentor every BIPOC student that's out there. You know, as a Latina, as you look at this documentary, tenure track assistant professor, I'm among 3% of faculty that have that credential. And so, you know, my door would always be, I'd get several knocks. So I explained to them, I said, you're going to probably also have some white mentors in your life. And there's, you know, what some people like to do, and that you may have to be aware of, is there's some people who like to collect people of color, who like to collect students of color. And it was so interesting because, you know, the moment I said that, you could start seeing heads nod around the room. And I'm going to describe those a little bit more in a minute. But there was an immediate connection with that phrase, the collector, that I ended up talking about. And I left there thinking, maybe this is something I could write about. And so I went and I did some research, and I realized there was a gap in the literature. So there was lots of literature about advice about how to be a good mentor to a BIPOC student, right, or person, or protege, mentee. There was also lots of advice for how BIPOC students can be good mentees. There were lots of articles about white mentors and their experiences of mentoring people of color. But one of the things that I noticed is that there were not very many articles about the mentees or protégés, the BIPOC protégés experiences of their white mentor. There was an article that I found, but they interviewed the mentor and the mentee simultaneously, and which for me, you know, didn't lend itself to necessarily getting, you know, truthful and honest answers. And so I ended up, you know, beginning to write this article that I wrote. So before we start, there's an important analogy that I'd like you to be able to consider. There's a wonderful quote by Alexander de Heijer that says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. Or the way that I often tell my students, if the flower does not grow, you don't blame the flower, right? You need to be able to look around the flower to see what's going on in its environment that is either not allowing it to grow or allowing it to thrive, right? So before we start, a lot of people like to ask me, what is a mentor, right? And I love Carrie Ann Rockamore's quote for this. If you ask 10 different faculty members what mentoring is, how it works, what it looks like, and how to tell if it's effective, you will get 10 different responses, ranging from a once a year coffee date to a quasi-parental lifelong relationship. And so I would say that because it's a hard question to answer, because it can also be, in addition to formal programs, it can also be very informal. I'm sure many of you know people that have that, you know, person that you meet every so often, but they still make such a tremendous impact in your life, right? Okay, so what are the categories that I talked about? Okay, so the first one were the collectors. And as I said before, collectors tend to collect BIPOC mentees, right? These are the ones that will, and very often the mentees feel like they're on display, as if there's some kind of commitment to a demonstration of the mentor's commitment to diversity and inclusion. These mentees are often asked to serve on diversity committees or work on things related to DEI constantly, or they're asked to sit on panels to discuss, their experience. They're also really, as I said, it's more a representation of their commitment to inclusion is what it feels like. And it's like they kind of trot you out every so often. That's what it feels like when you're with a collector. Now, one of the things that the students said is they said, "Oh, I hate it when that happens. Oh my goodness." And, everybody else was sort of in agreement. And one of the things that I said to them, I said, well, I honestly believe, and this is what's really important and critical, most of it and much of it is unintentional. People don't even realize that they're doing it. The other thing that I explained to them is to not dismiss collectors, because the collectors in my life have always known where the resources are. Where to be able to go and find. So anytime there's almost this quid pro quo relationship that develops with my collectors, where I'll say, okay, I'll do this panel for you, but later on when I come and I need help, you're going to be there for me, sort of an understanding. I said, and that's kind of the relationship you develop with a collector. The next one is what I call a Nightlights. This came from a really clever student when I was at Agnes Scott College. And I was explaining to them that my husband and I were going to take my father to go get a car. And my husband is white. He's 6'1" Italian Irish man, right? And my dad is about as tall as I am. We're both about 5'1", in our brown little selves, right? And so we end up, so I explained to them, we're going to go get a car for my dad. And my student says, "Don't forget your nightlight." And everybody in the room started cracking up, right? And I, of course, did not get the joke. And what they meant was, don't forget to take Greg, that's my husband, don't forget to take Greg with me, because I'm going to get different treatment when I'm with him versus when I'm with if I was just there by myself. And sure enough, what my husband likes to do is to drop us off at the entrance, and then he joins us after he parks the car. So we walk in, my father and I, and a salesperson starts to kind of, of course, approaches us and starts to show us, sort of the more kind of low end used cars that are available on the lot. Then my husband entered the space, and all of a sudden it's like it changed. And we started to see the more, not necessarily high end, but better looking, used cars that were on the lot. And I just kind of gave a look. My husband and I have gotten sort of this unspoken way that we were able to speak to each other. And I just kind of looked up at him and he said, "No, that's okay. We'll be fine." And we walked out, of the space. And so I call that a nightlight because many nightlights understand the inherent challenges at HWIs or PWSs. That's predominantly white spaces. So they know and believe that is something that is challenging for BIPOC mentees. They also help BIPOC mentees navigate the unknown and unforeseeable curves and twists of what it's like to be in those spaces. They provide light in dark, unfamiliar spaces. And this is what's really critical. They use their privilege, social, and cultural capital to help intervene in certain situations. And so, they also help to make the invisible visible. I call them my translators because they're able to tell me the rules that I may not be familiar with, that often show up whenever I'm in a professional workspace, right? And the difference that makes the biggest difference between nightlights and collectors, right, is that nightlights are usually, they're not necessarily a sustained relationship. They sort of pop in at those necessary times, as I said, to shed light to particular instances. And they may not be able to understand where you're coming from, but they do understand that there are, and they do understand and believe that there are challenges. I remember that when my husband and I were courting, I told him, when something happens, when I experience, a discriminatory event, not if, but when, I just need you to believe me. I don't need you to fix. I don't need you to tell me, I just need you to believe me. And he said, "Marisela, I'm so grateful that you told me that because I would have wanted to fix it. I would have wanted to try to make you feel better." And we had a really great conversation about what it meant, what I needed him to be for me in that time, in that moment. And so there have been many instances when he's been a nightlight, in my life. Then, of course, the one you have is allies. And unfortunately, there's other names. People use allies, accomplices, co-conspirators. They're not all exactly the same thing, but it's the spirit behind it is very similar. And unfortunately, this is the one that's least likely to encounter. And this is what I shared with my students, at that program. So one of the things that makes allies so wonderful is they are able to make very meaningful connections with you without asserting equality. So many of the allies that I've had in my life have been people who, for example, came from first generation backgrounds themselves, or came from working class backgrounds, or who were queer identified, and so they were able to understand and relate to my experiences without saying, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're going through. I went through this too. So without, as I said, asserting sort of an equivalency to it. The other thing is that allies, their actions speak much louder than their words. They're not about just saying that they're committed to diversity and inclusion. They actually show it. The other wonderful thing is that they can take criticism and feedback and recover quickly. The allies that I've had in my life that have either hurt my feelings or have, said something that were challenging, or I had an ally one time, for example, who kept asking me to be part of panels, related to gender, and she started kind of heading down that road, and I had a talk, and I said, so-and-so, I really need you to back off on asking me to do all these panels. I'm not, this is, because you are my ally, and I look at, I'm going to say yes to you. And I know I can say no, but I need you to understand that I will say yes because of the relationship that we have, but I need you to take it easy and just calm down a little bit, please, and understand that I have, be a little bit more selective about the opportunity that you present to me. And she said, Marisela, I am so grateful that you told me that. Thank you so much, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes with collectors, if you try to tell them that something's happened, or that you're offended, or that you're hurt, or that, there's something that's frustrating you, in my experience, the collectors have usually started crying. And so what ends up happening is you end up soothing and calming them down, when initially I was the one that was hurt in the first place, but then I have to turn all that energy to the collector to say, no, I know that you're not racist. I know you don't mean this. I know you don't, and it had almost kind of calming people down, and it changes the dynamics completely. And what I experience completely gets invisible. The other thing is allies are able to build trust with consistency and humility. When they don't know something, they're willing to say, you know what, I'm not familiar with that. Can you share more about that? So the other great thing I love about allies is they push their mentees beyond their best. The allies in my life have been able to say, you know what, Marisela, yeah, I'm pushing you because I know you can do this. I know that it's inside you. And it helps me to believe in myself even more when that happens. So I wrote this article and I received, lots of emails. Oh, I'm sorry, before I say that, one of the things that I'd like to talk about back with the collectors is that the collectors, I believe, are very sincere people. I want to make that really clear. They're very sincere, but you can be very sincere, but you can also be sincerely wrong. And I think that that's one of the aspects of collectors that they don't realize. But as I said, I received a lot of emails, and one of the things that a lot of the BIPOC folks who have been emailing to me told me is that they feel seen, that this is the first time that somebody's been able to actually name their experiences in a meaningful way. So one of the things that I wanted to share that I think is important is sort of the trajectory. Oftentimes what happens is, I can give you advice about how to be with your mentee in the moment, but many people don't realize sort of what's happened before your mentee has even gotten to you. And so I want to give you an idea of what many students of color, many people of color experience along the way. So in K through 12, for example, school is their life. Most, if not all of the teachers are usually white. You can even think to yourself in your own educational experience. I ask my students often, I want you to think about your teachers and try to imagine how many of them, or remember how many of them were people of color. And it's so remarkable. It happens every time. You can start to see them think, and their eyes are sort of, and then they just kind of come to this realization. And many of them have told me, Dr. MC, you're the first one I've ever had. And they're in college when they're telling me this. And so most of the students that BIPOC folks interact with are usually white teachers. The other thing is, this is also the first time they realize that they're different. And so there's a story that I have about my, when I was playing in the mud with a friend, Christy and Stacy. Christy was white, Stacy was black. And we were playing in the mud, and Stacy says, Christy's white, I'm black, what are you? And, points to my skin, my arm. And I said, I don't know. And she said, you're mixed. And I said, let me go check. And so I ran inside the house and I said, Mom, am I mixed? And she said, no. And I said, well, then what am I? She said, well, you're brown. So I ran outside and declared to my friends, I'm brown, and so kids at the very young age start to distinguish racial differences at a very, very early age. Most often, they're also the first in their family. There's a lot of first gen scholars that you come out of here, and they're first in their family to be able to go to college, and it's a really big deal in their family. It's a huge deal to be able to do that, because education is really seen as a way to be able to kind of escape, either poverty or be able to achieve mobility in the United States, those sorts of things. So then you go on to undergraduate, and when you're an undergraduate, the differences become painfully clear. There was an instance when I was at college, where they were doing a diversity exercise called Cross the Room. And it first started out with kind of some benign things. Cross the room if you like pizza, right? So ha ha ha, everybody's crossing the room because everybody likes pizza. And then it started to get a bit more serious, right? The reasons to cross the room. And so they come to me and they got to the point there. If your parents make over $100,000 a year, cross the room. And a huge swath of students cross the room. And there's just a few of us, standing on the other side of the room. Then they say, if your parents make $75,000 a year or more, cross the room. And then another swath of people go until it's just myself and my friend Sentwali, who's an African-American man, right? And we're standing there on the other side. And so I'm looking, and most of the people that are on the other side are white. So it's just myself, and all I see is a sea of white faces on the other side of the room. And so then they say, if your parents make more than $50,000 a year, because their goal was to try to get everybody to cross the room, right? And Sentwali looked at me, and I'll never forget, he said, I'm sorry, because his mother was a teacher, and he walked across the room. And so I was just there by myself on the other side. And they said, somebody in almost a very pitiable way said, how can you afford to go here? And I said, my parents make $50,000 a year. What of it? And or $48,000 a year. How did I know that my parents made $48,000 a year? It's because I filled out the FAFSA forms. And there's a lot of people that didn't know in college how much their parents make, or not familiar with that because their parents took care of all that for them. Many of the BIPOC students end up becoming work study students, and they end up sending a lot of the money that they make home. That's a really big, important deal. The other thing too is that, being first gen goes from being an honor to being a label. And that's where you start to realize that yet another difference that you're there. And this is also a time when they begin to assert their identity. When I was at Michigan, I was asked by a collector to go and sit on a panel and talk about my experience at the University of Michigan. And there was a gentleman, a father, he was white. He stood up in the back of the room and he said, "You stole my daughter's spot." And I was there at the time when, affirmative action, lawsuits were going on, at about that time. So that was about the time that they were talking about with that. And there are 3 times in my life, I can count them, when I knew precisely what to say, exactly what to say in the moment. Every other time, I'm a 10 minutes later person. I'm like, I should have said that. And I never, sit and think about it. But in this particular moment, I said, okay, sir, I'm really sorry that you feel that way. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. And I started to tell him the leadership things, my grades, so on and so forth. And you can kind of see him softening, almost as if I deserve to be there, right? And I said, but I do have a question for you. Who told you it was her spot? And I just let it hang there for a minute. And of course, he didn't have anything to say. But just this understanding and this idea that the privilege that it was supposed to be his daughter's spot, why wasn't it mine? And I had a challenging time at Michigan, especially with affirmative action going on. And I used to kind of walk around Michigan saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm here. This is so amazing. And I had this wonderful mentor say, Marisela, you need to stop walking around here like Michigan did you a favor. Where else did you get accepted to go to school? And I told her all the other places that I was accepted. She goes, you could have gone to any one of those places, but instead you chose to come to Michigan. And you being here, you make Michigan a better place to be. And let me tell you, after that, I owned that campus. That's all I needed to hear. And that place suddenly became mine, right? And so the other story that I want to share when I was back in undergrad was with my father. So I remember that my father worked in a factory, and there was one summer that I didn't get applications out in enough time, or I just wasn't being diligent. And I ended up getting a job in a factory. Now, factory work, there's nothing wrong with factory work. I'm going to make that clear. But my father and I would come home at about the same time, and he would go and take a shower immediately, sort of wash the factory off of him, right? I, on the other hand, kind of walked around a little bit, sort of chilled. And he came out one time from after taking a shower, and he called me to the living room, and he said, "Mija, come here for a minute." And Mija is a term of endearment, means my daughter, or my love, And he said, "Mija, please come in here." And I said, "Okay, papi." So I sat down with him, and he showed me his hands, and he said, "I want you to look at my hands." And I looked at his hands, and he has working man's hands. They were, callous, they're scars, things like that I noticed. He goes, "Now let me look at yours." And I put my hands in his. And he said, "Mija, I work this hard so you don't have to. Please quit this factory job and get yourself an office job." And I'm sitting there crying, and I just thought, okay, I will, absolutely. And I ended up working for the W.K. Kellogg Foundation as an intern. And really, that was where I got a chance to start to really learn about the Ph.D. and what it means to do that. So moving on, sometimes you can go on to get a master's or a JD. There's a million hoops, and it feels like there's so little progress that you're making. And because the numbers are smaller, the responsibilities, the diversity responsibilities become bigger in those spaces, and it moves on to graduate school as well and follows you there, too. And you often become sort of the only person in the room, the only person or one of a handful of people of color in the room. And it can be very challenging because you're often asked to be the representative, of your entire race, of your entire group, and that can be really challenging. And people don't realize, that when we enter spaces, we count. We go through, and for myself, for example, I always count how many other people of color are in the room and how many women are in the room. And I used to struggle with my weight a great deal. So I always looked to see if I was the biggest person in the room, to be able to kind of see sort of the weight, discrimination that happens out there as well was very much on the forefront of my mind. And there's this moment where you see another person of color in a predominantly white space, and there's a connection that you're able to make, like, okay, I see you, you see me, but we can't hang out together too much because now we're self-segregating, right? And so that's the kind of stuff that ends up happening before we even get to you. So this is the stuff that's been written on our hearts before we've gotten to you. So the other thing is we've also been taught a number of rules, and I'm just going to go through a few of them here. We've been taught that you have to work twice as hard to get half as much. That's just a rule that many of us have understood. The other thing is we've been told they will accept mediocrity from their own, but not from you. You have to be excellent always. I had a professor in grad school who was teaching teaching a book called Black Wealth, White Wealth. And it's a book that every sociologist should know, absolutely, like you should know it cold, right? And so he came into the room and he literally read the back of the book and said, "What do you all think?" And I remember sitting there thinking I could never be that unprepared and still be taken seriously, and that was really, really, I remember being very challenging for me. You always have to look ready, right? Don't give them something to say about you. Notice that many BIPOC folks are constantly dressed very well, right? I used to laugh when I would see a fellow graduate student come into class looking just totally jacked up, right? And again, I would sit there and think I could never get away with that. And I imagine that it has to be similar in a lot of scientific spaces, for example, where you're required to do a lot of outdoor work. For some scientists, messiness and dirt and dinge is a mark of honor, but for some BIPOC members, we learned that we could not be dirty because it meant that we could not either care for ourselves or we're afraid of fulfilling a stereotype that can be out there as well. The other thing too is you learn very quickly to fix your face. And that means that when something happens and you hear something, discriminatory or racist or what have you that has just been said, you cannot go, you can't do that. You have to fix your face and just sort of look around to see if anybody else heard that. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor, we were talking about Irish immigrants, and they said, so, what is this all about? What is this all about, everyone? And the room was silent, and he comes to me and he says, Marisela, and I honestly, I said, I'm sorry, Professor, so I really don't know what you're talking about. And he said, immigration, of course. Now, immigration isn't anything I was studying. at the time. And so, and again, my face, I had to fix it. And I just kind of looked around. And fortunately, there was a colleague of mine who was white who looked, and he just kind of went, just sort of shook his head. And I knew, okay, that's not in my head. It wasn't just me that experienced that. The other thing is you can't really swear. It's always remarkable to me how many times I hear people swear in meetings, and it's like sort of no big deal. But I always felt like if I did, I would be seen as unintelligent. The other big thing is we're often taught, before you ask the question, go find the answer first. Never bother busy people. So sometimes if your mentee is not necessarily coming to you at the time, it's because they're probably trying to figure it out themselves before they come to you. And that's why allies make they make the space open, an open door policy that you can come and talk to them at any particular time. The other thing that I was taught is that to ask them about themselves, because it's their favorite topic. When I was interviewing for grad school, all I had to say is, tell me a little bit about your research. And they started talking and talking about all their research. So next thing you know, about 15, 20 minutes have passed, and they leave, and they're saying, you know what, I like that Marisela. She's really fantastic. They haven't learned a thing about me, but all I had to say was just get them to talk about themselves, which I think was really interesting. The other big thing that I learned is never to make them cry. As I shared before with a collector, my experiences with collectors, is that there's this feeling of like, oh my goodness, and they're so mortified that they hurt my feelings or they said something that it really tears them down, and they inevitably, as I said, end up crying. And those tears, they're very powerful. They're very powerful. And it puts me in a position to be the caretaker, and I have to put my feelings aside to be able to take care of that individual. The other thing, if they ask a question, be careful what you say. It has to be a very measured response. This is in person, and this is also by email. I used to have my husband read my emails before I sent them out, because I said, I want to make sure I don't come across as too angry or too aggressive or so on and so forth. Can you please read this and make sure that it's free of all that? And then we'd hit send. And I remember it would always take me such a long time to be able to do that. I couldn't just say what was on my mind most of the time. The other thing too is don't ever tell your mentee, just tell your family that you want to ... fill in the blank. That's not always easy. When we come to these spaces, we're representing our family. I would always tell people that when I crossed the stage at law school, it wasn't just me that was crossing the stage. My family was there with me too. I went to Michigan to represent my community. I went to law school to represent my family. It wasn't until I got to the Ph.D. that I felt like that was all mine. And largely because my parents didn't know, my family didn't know what a Ph.D. was. They just knew I would be called doctor at the end of it. The other thing, again, this goes to, you don't just represent, you represent your family. You don't represent yourself, you represent your family. And that's a very, very strong, message that we get, growing up. So some advice, I want to make sure I'm on time. So some advice for collectors. Understand that when you take us places, as I said, one of the first things we do is we count. We see how many other people are there and try to take time to actually introduce us to people. Many times the collectors would often just take me, and that's where I felt like I was really decoration more than a person. That my allies, when they take me to places, they go, oh, so-and-so, this is Marisela, this is her research, this is her area. I thought that you all would like each other because da-da-da-da. And they would connect me with people right away. I would always leave with business cards in my hands and people who were willing to sit and talk to me about something. And that's the huge difference between the collectors and the allies. Also, asking what can I do, that's not enough, because you need to let us know what you can do. So what can I do? Do you want me to write a letter? Do you want me to help you find some grants? Do you want me to look over your grant before you submit it? Something that, because we don't really know what you can do. What sort of skill sets and what resources you have available to you that we could actually ask for. If you ask us to do something, know that we may eventually ask you for something eventually to do, sort of that quid pro quo relationship, and be ready for it and be okay with it. Finally, unfortunately, collectors, you get the performance, not the person. One of the things, I'm writing an article right now that goes from an HWI to an HBCU, Peace from Performativity. And I never realized how much I was performing in white spaces, how much I was not really completely authentically myself in those spaces, because I didn't want to make people think certain things about me, or I was afraid of, stereotyping, or I never felt completely safe and comfortable to be myself. I remember the one time I let myself kind of go. Every time I get an article published, I do a dance in my office. I turn on Celia Cruz and I dance in my office. And I was in this one place where somebody walked by and they said, "Ooh, you're so spicy." And that moment it just messed up that moment for me. And so I stopped doing that. Here at Morehouse, my students come in the office and dance with me. And it's such a huge difference. For nightlight tips, be ready for the taco moments. In my article, I write about Mr. Walsh, who I brought tacos wrapped in aluminum foil, and this was in elementary school. This was before tacos were a really big craze, before Taco Bell was like, this is awesome, blah, blah, and so forth, right? Before they became really big. And so he comes in, and all the kids, of course, around the table are like, "Ew, what's that? That smells funny, blah, blah, blah." And Mr. Walsh was the most popular teacher in the school, the most popular teacher. So he comes up and he goes, "Oh, are those tacos?" And I remember saying, "Yes." And he said, "Can I have one?" And I said, "Yes." And he went and like tore half of a taco, ate it, and goes, "This is delicious. Thank you so much." Winked at me and walked away. What do you think happened after he walked away? The students are, "Can I have some? I want some. I want to try it." He took my weird and turned it cool just in that moment. Now, he could have said, "You all need to understand that Marisela brings her culture here." Blah, blah, blah. He could have admonished them in that moment, but he didn't. He turned it into, he used his cultural, his capital, his social capital in that space to make it change for me. The other thing that somebody told me is, for the taco moments, is I remember I was getting ready to go to a dinner, and it was one of the first times I'd been invited to, well, not the first time, but I was talking about how I always go to these dinners and I hate it when the tables are in a circle because I never know which drink is mine and which bread is mine. It makes me anxious because, I have to wait to see somebody reach for theirs and then I'll know. And then I had this wonderful mentor give me this really cool tip about B and D. Like he goes, "Take your fingers and put them under the table." You put them under the table, and one is for B and the other is for D. So the B is your bread and the D is your drink. And that just made such a huge difference for me. I don't get anxious anymore whenever I go to these dinners that do that. Ask the question that nobody thought to ask. This came from an experience that I had with a speech therapist. They told me that I had to get speech therapy because I kept saying jello and cheese instead of cheese and yellow, right? And so the speech therapist sat down with me and she said, "Okay, Marisela, say yellow." And I said, "Yellow." And she said, "Okay, say cheese." And I said, "Cheese." She said, "Say chips." And I said, "Chips." And ships and ships. And I could tell you the difference between the two, so on and so forth, right? And then finally she just said, "Marisela, why do you say jello?" And I said, "Well, it's because my mom says it that way." My mother had an accent, and so I was imitating her accent whenever I said those things. And she just asked the simple question and realized I didn't need speech therapy. And in that moment, I remember she just explained to me the right way to pronounce things without making me feel like my mother was wrong in doing that. And I still had to go to speech therapy because it was part of my plan. And so I would go into her office and basically read books, during our time in our sessions. I was supposed to be getting speech therapy. The other thing to do is to intervene when they're tokenized. This has happened for me in a meeting. One of my, I had a sort of a nightlight moment. Well, it was actually an ally that did it, but it could be a really great nightlight moment as well. Whenever you're in a meeting and somebody's being, and the person of color becomes a representative for all people of color, just the person that was in the room said, "You know what, we're all smart people here. I recommend that, let's go back and do our own research, and then we'll come back and revisit this discussion," and took that responsibility off of me and placed it on everybody else in the room, which I thought was really wonderful. The other thing too is to take a moment to read their work or get familiar with their research, and drop them a quick note that lets them know. I had this, one professor that came to me one time. He said, "I just came back from a conference, sociology of education, and you made me sound really smart." And I said, "Oh, how did I do that?" He said, "Well, your research, you're talking about cases that people have never heard about." And so I got a chance to tell them, "Oh, have you ever heard about this case? Have you ever heard about?" And I got a chance to brag about you when I was there. And that just, that lit me up inside, like, okay, what I am doing is important and is special. Quickly for allies and accomplices. Share from your own life and remember to ask them about theirs. One of the things that I loved is, I had an ally one time tell me about how he was taking care of his ailing mother, that his mother was, very sick and getting older, and he had to take care of her and would go there, weekly and so on and so forth. And my respect grew for him so much in that moment, just because he shared something personal, and I appreciated that. The other thing too, I'm sorry, is to ask them, nobody that I've ever known, has ever asked me, what was it like growing, my allies will ask me, but other people, they don't ask, what's it like growing up in Battle Creek, or what was it like being the first, wanting to know a little bit more about me, and because they know that story about me. And we tell you our story. You will hear it very often. We tell it over and over and over again. We've gotten used to telling it. The other thing too is to talk about, I want to talk that pedigree doesn't equal quality. I think a lot of times, those of us who went to state colleges or maybe smaller colleges and didn't go to any of the Ivies can feel really insecure about that, and making it clear that, what, you don't have to go to an Ivy to be a quality researcher, to be a quality, individual contributing to the field. And I've always appreciated my allies that made me feel that way. Make sure that you respect your mentee, their time, and their work. You can just say, I know that you're busy, but can we talk about, X, Y, and Z? Or if not, is there a better time that we can get together to talk about that? I remember, that makes me feel so much more respected when people do that. And also remember, many often we're double experts, because we not only know your field, like the general field, we understand how race interacts with that field. So that makes us a double expert really in many situations. The other thing is, don't just tell a mentee what to do, continue to model it, practice it, show them, understand that being an ally or an accomplice, it takes time, effort, and energy. Be honest with your own limitations and admit your mistakes when that happens. I have loved it when people have just been able to, one of the things I always like to follow up the story of that professor who, said immigration, of course, right? One of the things that I will always respect about him is, and that turned that moment around for me, is he asked me to come into his office shortly thereafter. And he said, Marisela, I'm really sorry that I did that to you in class. And I thought I was in trouble when he was calling me to his office, right? I thought I was in trouble. And I said, okay. And I sat there and I said, I'm sorry, Dr. So-and-so, I don't know what to say. Nobody has ever apologized to me like that. He said, well, I'm sorry, that's been your experience. And that just made such a huge difference. He admitted his mistake. He didn't necessarily become an ally for me at that time, but I think that my respect grew for him so much more in that moment. And also, don't be afraid to tell what my father calls the real deal Holyfield, right? Make sure that you tell them what it's really like. One of the things that I used to do is I used to have, I had a mentor who wasn't, an advisor who wasn't tremendously personable, right? And she told me, she said, I know that I can come off as this particular way, but just know that I really am genuinely interested. I know I come off as standoffish and, so on and so forth. I've been told that, but just please know that that's not really who I am. And that, again, made such a huge difference for us in our relationship. And finally, increase your own interactions and their interactions with BIPOC researchers. Read the research done by BIPOC researchers. One of the things that somebody told me is like, well, how do I find out about, Black geologists? And I was sitting on the phone with them and I Googled Black geologist, as I was talking to them, and sent them all these links of all these amazing, scholars that were out there that I had just learned about in doing that. It's something as simple as a Google search. I know that that's kind of become a trite thing to say, Google it. But, I think that, the person that I was talking to genuinely didn't, thought that they had to go into, I guess, the archives or something to figure that out. But it'd be amazing what you learn just from a simple search. So, one of the things that I generally like to go to is maybe some scenarios, to give you an idea of what is. So a nightlight or an ally. So a mentor encourages their BIPOC mentee to apply for a grant not related to diversity and inclusion. That's a very nightlight move to do that. Again, it's momentary in that moment to do that. A mentor encourages their BIPOC mentee to apply for a grant not related to diversity and inclusion, and then reviews it with them before they submit it. That's ally behavior. A mentor tells a mentee whose family is from Mexico, oh, I loved my vacation in Mexico. The people were so warm and kind. And this has happened to me. And I know what they're trying to complement the background that I came from, but that's very collector behavior that happens. A mentor asks a student, how do I pronounce your name? I want to make sure that I get it right. That's a nightlight or an ally behavior. They don't shorten it. They're willing to take the time. And I know that what happens sometimes is that there's some people that just get tired of having to tell people how to pronounce their name all the time, so they shorten it for them. I give people a standard 3 strikes and you're out, especially if I'm never going to interact with you again. I say Marisela, and I give explanations for it. And if after a while, I'm just call me Marcela. Because if I spent time having to train everybody how to say my name, I would never get my work done. But I do teach the people that I'm going to be interacting with a lot, I do teach them how to say my name, and I take the time to do that. A mentor says, I grew up poor, so I know exactly what you're going through. That's very much collector behavior as well. However, a mentor says, a lot of what you're sharing resonates with me. I know it's not the same thing, but I grew up poor and I never quite felt like I fit in, especially with all the rich kids that were around my school. And then share a story, about that experience. That's ally behavior. I hope I've kind of given some ideas, but just a little bit about what those differences are. Remember that some of us, if you can love us when we're prickly, on the outside, sometimes we can be prickly on the inside too. If you can love us when we're prickly, we'll stick with you. Remember also that many BIPOC people have learned to be the shiny object in the room, but not everybody is shiny. Make sure that you pay attention to the ones that, have taught to do. We've been taught to keep our heads down and just do the work. We are very creative. One of the things that my advisor told me, she said, Marisela, you're doing 3 dissertations in one. You can just choose one case to study and do that. But the fact that I'm studying 3 school desegregation cases and everything attached to that, I had to become an expert in, Chinese schools, Indian boarding schools, Mexican schools, and a segregated schooling for Black children as well. And so I became a multiple expert in that. But I had to tell that story. That's the other research that I do. The other thing is to remember that, we're resilient. Going back to the flower, right? Many of us flowers have learned to burst through concrete, right? And that is possible. There are many of us who have burst through concrete. But is that really the kind of world that we want our flowers to grow up in, right? To think about that. And to remember that we're unicorns, right? We may not know it. But many of us are unicorns in these spaces, and it feels very lonely and isolating sometimes to be the only or one of a handful. But why do you do all this? Why do you take all this time? Because we're worth it. So final thoughts. These are not some static categories with clear lines. One person's ally may be another person's nightlight. All allies are also nightlights, but not all nightlights are necessarily allies. And a collector, unfortunately, is never an ally, but they often believe that they're an ally. And that's where the challenging part comes around. So thank you so much for allowing me to present this for you. And I'm open to questions and looking forward to hearing from you all. Thank you so, so much.
Wow, that was some amazing storytelling. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing and in this space. So I know there are lots of questions that will come up. So Leela, I don't know if you can see any hands that have been raised.
Not at the moment, but we'll keep an eye out for them.
I think that earlier on there were some comments that, Marilyn Suter said we also have to write and speak well, no grammatical errors
Absolutely.
are allowed, so I'm wondering if you sort of had experienced that. We'll give folks a chance to write some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, Grammarly has became my best friend, I double check everything that I do. My husband was my best editor. He would, make sure to read things for me and check that out. The other thing that I use a lot is wordhippo.com. It's a thesaurus. To make sure that I am, not using, everybody has a tendency to use the same words over and over again, but I never ever, it's such a fear for me to ever sound unintelligent. That is a very real fear. Despite the fact that I have a JD and a PhD, to this day, I still struggle with, moments I never want anybody to question my intelligence. Yeah.
I do see a question, in the chat. So just in case someone didn't catch it, how do you navigate placing trust in people from all 3 groups?
Yes, definitely.
That's a really
Yes.
excellent question.
So with collectors, there's no, I wouldn't say that there's a trust relationship there. The trust is limited. I trust that they have the resources that are going to be important for me later. So that's where that kind of trust builds. Now, whether or not they'll actually use those resources, I wish I could be more confident in. But that's it. With Nightlights, just that those moments when they've just kind of jumped in, and not like, sort of white savior jumping in to save you kind of thing. It's a really sort of different, low key kind of way that they handle it. Just like I said, like, Mr. Walsh just kind of walked in, did his thing, and walks away. No big deal. And he didn't also come and say, "Are you okay? Is everything all right?" Blah blah blah. No, he just handled it, very peacefully. And that makes me feel like, okay, this is somebody I can talk to about things. This is somebody I can ask questions for. And allies, I am able to build their trust because they try to show that I am trustworthy by sharing things with me. I did have one ally one time that had neglect. She didn't tell me about something that was going on, with her husband. And I remember I was very hurt, by that. And I remember we had a conversation. I said, I tell you everything about what's going on with me, and you didn't tell me about what's going on with your husband, and I feel that really hurts my feelings. And we had a really great discussion because she said, Marisela, I grew up, first gen, I'm working class. I grew up, you don't give people your problems. You're not supposed to, love. And we just had a really great conversation about why she didn't say it. Not like, oh, I'm so sorry, blah, 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 just she explained to me, okay, this is why I didn't, and I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you in that way. Which I thought was really, really powerful. And that built trust. This is somebody that I just trust implicitly, because we're able to have those kinds of conversations.
Yeah. So for those folks who joined the presentation a little later, just after we began, yes, you will get a copy of the recording once it's been rendered. Because you registered for it, you'll be receiving it. But this person also asked another question, like, what is your top advice on how mentors can strive to be an ally and not a collector?
Yes, definitely. So I guess my top advice would be to be real. You know what I mean? To let somebody see who you are, to let them see you when you're not feeling necessarily confident, to tell them, I'm having a hard day with this, or I'm kind of struggling with this, or I'm having, an issue. That there's a vulnerability that allies have that collectors simply just don't. And the other thing too is just to be grateful. Allies are tremendous. My allies in my life have been so grateful, and they make me feel like I'm a rock star. That's one thing they're always saying that. Marisela, you're a rock star, and and I think that's one of the other things. So there's, I guess, two pieces of advice, is to make sure you do that, but not just say you're a rock star. One of the things that I loved about it is they don't just say you're a rock star. They say you're a rock star because ... and they tell me the things that they admire about me, and that just fills my cup, and lets me know, okay, that I'm somebody worthy of respect, Yeah.
Or you're so cool because of this thing that you did, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I texted somebody. I was nervous about giving this presentation, and I always get the jitters beforehand, and I texted someone and I said, I need some hype here. I need some hype. She goes, "You are going to blow their minds, Marisela." So,
And you did. Look at the comments in the chat,
that
So
helps me.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't have any of the folks who are asking questions if you want to, unmute and speak. So we're happy to do that. But Mika is commenting that, communication between humans can be very challenging. I think while you were speaking, and Marilyn is also asking if you're willing to share. What would you consider as a career development challenge, like, in this time, now?
Now for
Perhaps
me,
something your students have, maybe something your students have faced, or maybe you. I'm not sure what is intended. Yeah.
so, well, I mean, for me personally, right now, I'm getting ready to go up for tenure, and that's a really big deal, in academia, obviously. And one of the things I'm building a relationship with somebody here at Morehouse that I have a feeling he's going to be an ally for me. I just have a feeling about it. And I know because he said, you want me to share my materials with you? For when I went up for tenure, I can share them with you, because I was explaining how anxious I was about writing my materials, and I wanted to make sure I was on the right track, And he said, "You want me to share my materials with you? I'd be more than happy to." And I said yes, and he sent them to me last night, like right away. immediately. And so I'm like, you know what, I have a pretty good feeling about this guy, that I just think he's going to really be there for me. So yeah, I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. So there's another one. Do you have any guidance on how junior faculty or faculty can navigate power structures within a department or a program where collectors hold positions of authority?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes, definitely. Usually I go and I try to find there's a person that can be an ally or can be a nightlight in that space, and I get advice from them. They are usually the person that intervenes on my behalf. That's been my experience is that, it's not me that has to do the work. Then the allies in my life are the ones that say, "Don't worry, I got you on this," and have been able to intervene on my behalf without again, not the I'm saving you kind of da 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 da, give me a cape and I'm coming in to fly, but it's like, no, I get it, and then they end up managing that for me, and then give me advice about how to navigate it myself. And sometimes a collector is just going to be a collector, and you just learn. I always tell people, once you tell me who you are, I know how to handle you. And then you just learn, okay, I know where to put this person now, and they're just going to be, the collector, and hopefully if there's something that I need from them later, I'll be able to get it from them, because remember, collectors have the resources.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So one last question, and I think we're almost out of time here.
Sorry. Yes.
So any sort of comment on the value of having mentors outside of your immediate circle?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that's what's critical, is having somebody that can be able to give you that outside perspective. I have several, mentors in my life that are not necessarily academics, because then they help keep me real, because academia can be, a very interesting place to be. It can be very insular. And I think that they help me stay connected to the quote unquote the real world, and help me to be real in my world, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Great. And just one last question here. Once again, can you define a collector?
Sure, absolutely. So a collector is someone that almost, it seems like they like to collect people of color, right? They like to collect them, and they're more sort of, they're there to express the commitment to diversity and inclusion. So it's almost like, see, I've got this person who's going to be on a panel. See how awesome that I am, or see how wonderful, see how committed to diversity I am. I'm able to do this. And collectors, it's really collector behavior. They're also the ones that will ask to do all the diversity stuff. They'll ask you to sit for the photographs, for the marketing material. They'll ask you to sit in the interview to, that's the, looking for an opportunity hire, diversity hire position, or something to that effect. We'll have you sit on that, panel, or well, if you're having somebody come to campus or come to your group that's a person of color, they're going to immediately connect you to them, which can be a good thing. I understand that. That is a good thing. You're now meeting somebody, but it's like, it's immediately all things diversity goes to this person. And, one of the things that I would get so frustrated with is that, the way I tell people, so when I was at PWIs, I was always the diversity hire. It didn't matter what I did. It didn't matter my accomplishments. I was always going to be the diversity hire. But in Morehouse, I'm a scholar, and that's how I'm treated. And that's the difference. So, yeah.
Great. So thank you so much, Marisela. This was amazing. Thank you for sharing all your stories. And I know we could go on for another hour, and
Yes.
we've had such an amazing conversation. So, so thank you for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We do have, if you miss, again, a recording will become available, and you will be able to share it with others. If you're a department chair, a department head, or a leader in your own department or organization, please contact me if you're interested in joining the larger community of department heads and chairs. We also have a workshop coming up at the AGU meeting in December. We still have a few spots left, so we'd love to have you there. And last slide, please, Leela. We have another webinar coming up on November 3rd, sort of talking about the successes and how you kind of bring up the enrollments and manage all the expectations for having high enrollments in your department. So please join us for a panel and community discussion. And if you missed any of the previous webinars, please check them out on the website listed here. So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you next month.